Head 6. The sufferings of some, upon the account of extraordinary executing of judgment upon notorious incendiaries and murdering public enemies by private persons, in the circumstances wherein they were stated, vindicated. Surely, saith Solomon, oppression maketh a wise man mad, as on the other hand a gift destroyeth the heart. Which, whensoever there is a concurrence and verification of both together, makes it very incident and no ways to be admired, that either former actions of the oppressed be censurable, or that there be found many to censure them, either out of ignorance or prejudice at a far-off glance, which a nearer or narrower inspection of circumstances, through a prospect of charity, would not so readily condemn. When the oppression of tyrants comes to such a height and pinch of extremity, that it not only threatens a community with desolation, but induces a necessity of unavoidable dissolution, and reduces a people to such a paroxysm of desperation and consternation in respect of human deliberation, bringing them to their wits' end, that either they must succumb as slaves, emancipate consciences, persons, liberties, properties, and all they are or have, to the lust of raging tyrants and their revenging emissaries, or surrender themselves and their posterity, and, which is dearer, the interest of religion, to be destroyed. Then it is no wonder that they be sometimes necessitated in such an extremity to apply extreme remedies to extremity of evils, and forced to fall upon such expedients to prevent their utter extermination, as at other times common order and ordinary justice would make extravagant. Yea, it is no marvel, though they fall into several real extravagancies, which are not to be justified nor extenuated, but rather it is to be acknowledged as a miracle of the Lord's mercy, that in such a case they are restrained from more scandalous excesses of that nature. Yet even then, such as live at ease, free of oppression, who are blinded with prejudice at the oppressed, and bribed with the indulgence and lenity of the oppressors towards themselves, will look upon these actions as transports of madness and effects of extravagant zeal, while they weigh them only in the scales of ordinary justice, and do not ponderate them in the balance of necessitated virtue, nor perpend to the circumstances which made those extraordinary acts of judgment, which materially are lawful at all times to be executed by some, to be then necessary acts of justice to be inflicted by them in such a case. But if either the oppressors themselves, or such who are blinded and bribed with their gifts, and killed with their kindnesses, not only into an omission of concurring, but into a condemning of such extraordinary attempts of taking off those destroyers, or if onlookers at a distance would seriously consider the ingeniously declare their opinion in a particular application of the case to themselves, what they would do in such circumstances, I doubt not, but as charity should oblige them to be sparing of their censure in a case whereof they have no experience, so justice, in resolving this point for themselves, would constrain them to justify such extraordinary and necessitated practices for self-preservation in preventing punishing by destroying their destroyers, and move them rather to admire their patience, who have suffered so much and so long those beasts of prey to devour them, than to censure their precipitancies of being constrained to endeavor to deliver themselves at last from and put an end to their cruelty, who did most annoy them. Quote, Yea, as Naphtali says very well, it were impossible that rational men, after the feeling of so sore grievances, and the teaching of so many and sad experiences, should still couch under the burden and submit themselves to the yoke of such vile apostate upstarts and bloody villains, and not rather acquit themselves like men, by pulling off these vizards, under which they mask their villainies and clack their violence, and plucking them out of that sanctuary of loyalty and refuge of authority, which they do not more pretend than profane by all their horrid rebellions against God and cruel murders executed upon the Lord's people, to the effect that in the righteous and deserved punishment of these wicked men, both the sin of the land might be sifted, and the fierce anger of the Lord averted. Unquote. Naphtali, 1st edition, page 134. Nevertheless, such lawful and, as one would think, laudable attempts for cutting off such monsters of nature, beasts of prey, burdens to the earth, as well as enemies to the commonwealth, are not only condemned as murderers and horrid assassinations, but criminally and capitally punished as such. And upon this account, the sufferings of such as have left a conviction upon the consciences of all that knew them, of their honesty, integrity, soundness in the principles, and seriousness in the practice of religion, have been several singular and signally severe, and owned of the Lord to the admiration of all spectators, some being cruelly tortured and executed to the death, for essaying such execution of judgment, as Mr. Mitchell, others for accomplishing it, as Mr. Haxton of Rathlet, and others who avowed their accession to the cutting off of that arch-traitor Sharp, prelate of St. Andrews, and others for not condemning that and the like acts of justice, though they were as innocent of the facts as the child unborn. The foregoing historical representation of the matters of fact doth clear the circumstances of the actions, which, if ever any of that nature performed by private men without public authority could be justified, will at least demur the condemning of them. For the men, or rather monsters, thus removed, had not only been perjured apostates from and conjured enemies against God in a conspiracy with the devil to destroy the Reformation and the remnant that professed it, affronted blasphemers, perfidious betrayers of the country, and enemies to the commonwealth, malignant incendiaries, and habitual murderers of many of the Lord's people, who, for many notorious crimes, had forfeited their lives to justice, but were insolently prosecuting their murdering designs, informing the council, and instigating them against innocent people to destroy them utterly, procuring from them bloody orders to spare none, but cut off all who might fall into their hands, and vigorously and vigilantly with all violence pursuing their murdering mandates, both in their own persons and by villains, whom they hounded out as intelligencers to get, and to give notice where any of those people might be detected, whom they avowed a design to destroy, when in the heat and height of their rage they were cut off. The actors were no ways subject to them, nor any other way related than declared and independent enemies are to one another, having renounced all relation to them and their masters, as magistrates and their superiors, and were in no terms of peace with them, but maintaining in hostile opposition, and carrying, without cessation, arms to resist them. And when they got that advantage over them, that these enemies were seeking against them, they declared solemnly to them, and died, declaring it to the world, that they were not moved out of private revenge for personal injuries that they had done against themselves, but being touched with the zeal of God, love to their country, respect to justice trampled upon by tyrants, and for saving themselves, rescuing their brethren, and preventing their murdering them, because there were none that would or could execute justice upon them legally. Therefore they were forced to put forth their hands against them as enemies, with whose preservation their own could not consist. Their circumstances were such that they were redacted to the greatest of extremities, precluding all other human possibility of preserving themselves and their brethren from the destruction intended, and declaredly resolved, and restlessly fought and prosecuted by these murderers, being persecuted to the death by them, daily chased, hunted, waylaid, turned out of their own habitations, intercommuned, discharged, and denied all harbor in any house, under the hazard of the same pains that themselves were liable to, which was death by the present law, and so forced to hide in caves and dens, out of which they durst not come forth, if it were but to seek bread for themselves, without imminent danger of their lives. The country raising the hue and cry after them whenever they were seen, whereby many were killed as soon as they were apprehended. Hence they could neither escape in the land, nor by flight out of the land, passages by sea and land being stopped, and none suffered to go anywhere, without strict examination what they were, which was impossible for them to elude, and many other specialties of misery and danger were ingredients in their circumstances that no words can represent to them that are altogether strangers to them. Wherefore, in such a strait and pinch of perplexity, when they could not otherwise escape the fury of these firebrands, nor demur and deter the rest of them from an uncontrolled pursuit after the lives of innocents, nor otherwise avert the wrath of God against the land for the impunity of such vermin, and seeing there was no access to address themselves to magistrates, who by office are obliged to bring such villains to condign punishment, and none were found in public authority but such as patronized and authorized them, who, in confidence, they could not acknowledge, and in prudence durst not make application to them for fear of their lives, what could they do? What was left them to deliberate but to fall upon this extraordinary course, wherein if they have stumbled into some extravagancies as to the manner, who can think it strange, considering the case? But as that is not the debate, so as for such acts of vengeance as are peccant in the matter, and were not circumstantiate as above rehearsed, being disowned in their public declarations, and the actors excluded from their communion for whom I plead, it were iniquitous to impute the scandal of them to that suffering people. It is only the so circumstantiate necessitated extraordinary execution of judgment upon notoriously gross and grassant incendiaries, tyrants, and terrible murdering enemies, where there is no living for them, that I vindicate. And though the handling of this tender and quick-scented subject may seem odious to some, and my discourse upon it is pregnant with an oblique design to obviate such unmerited surmises, I must say it is only the wiping off of such reproaches as reflect on religion, the vindication of preterite extraordinary practices of this nature, the investigation of present duty with respect to future emergencies, and the restraining all extravagancies incident on this head, that I intend. However this may be exploded by this generation as odious and uncouth doctrine, yet in former periods of this church it hath been maintained with courage and asserted with confidence, how the ancient Scots, even after they received the Christian faith, served their tyrants and oppressors, how in the beginning of the Reformation the killing cardinal of David, Rizzio, were and are generally to this day justified, and what was the judgment and pleading of our reformers for practicing this principle against idolaters, etc., needs not here be repeated. Mr. Knox's judgment in particular is before declared, and will be further discovered if we consider how he resented his slackness in putting people to execute judgment in these words. Insert in second part of the Cloud of Witnesses, page 60, quote, "For God," said he, "had not only given me knowledge and a tongue to make known the impiety of the idol, but had given me credit with many, who would have put in execution God's judgments, if I would only have consented thereto. But so careful was I of the common tranquillity, and loath was I to offend some, that in secret conference with zealous men, I travelled rather to slacken that fervency God had kindled in them, than to animate and encourage them to put their hands to God's work, wherein I acknowledge myself to have done most wickedly, and from the bottom of my heart I do ask God pardon, that I did not what in me lay to have suppressed that idol from the beginning." Unquote. But the preceding historical representation doth abundantly demonstrate this is no novelty to assert that when the ruin of the country, suppression of religion, destruction of the remnant professing and suffering for it, and the wrath of God is threatened in, and for the impunity of idolaters and murderers, that by the law of God and man should die the death, and supposing always such as are in public office not only decline their duty, but encourage those destroyers, yea, authorize them themselves, we may not only maintain defensive resistance according to our capacity, but endeavor also vindictive and punitive force in executing judgment upon them in cases of necessity, as before circumstantial. And I am the more confident to assert it, that what I say cannot be condemned till first what our reformers have proven to be confuted. What our reformers have proven be confuted. However, to endeavor to make it somewhat clear, I shall permit some assertions to clear the state of the question, and then give some reasons for it, when clearly stated. First, it will be needful, for clearing our way, to show what length we may warrantably go in this matter of executing judgment, in our private capacity, in extraordinary cases of necessity, by setting down some propositions negative and positive, signifying what we disown, and what we own in this point.